Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Introduction and Chapter 1. Introduction. Heidi is a delightful story for children of life in the Alps, one of many tales written by the Swiss authoress Johanna Spyri, who died in her home at Zurich in 1891. She had been well known to the younger readers of her own country since 1880, when she published her story Heimatlos, which ran into 3 or more editions and which, like her other books, as she states on the title page, was written for those who love children as well as for the youngsters themselves. Her own sympathy with the instincts and longings of the child's heart is shown in her picture of Heidi. The record of the early life of this Swiss child amid the beauties of her passionately loved mountain home, and during her exile in the great town, has been for many years a favorite book of younger readers in Germany and America. Madame Spyri, like Hans Andersen, had by temperament a peculiar skill in writing the simple histories of an innocent world. In all her stories she shows an underlying desire to preserve children alike from misunderstanding and the mistaken kindness that frequently hinder the happiness and natural development of their lives and characters. The authoress, as we feel in reading her tales, lived among the scenes and people she describes, and the setting of her stories has the charm of the mountain scenery amid which she places her small actors. Chapter 1. Up the Mountain to Alm Uncle. From the old and pleasantly situated village of Mayenfeld, a footpath winds through green and shady meadows to the foot of the mountains, which on this side look down from their stern and lofty heights upon the valley below. The land grows gradually wilder as the path ascends, and the climber has not gone far before he begins to inhale the fragrance of the short grass and sturdy mountain plants, for the way is steep and leads directly up to the summits above. On a clear, sunny morning in June, 2 figures might be seen climbing the narrow mountain path. One, a tall, strong-looking girl; the other, a child whom she was leading by the hand, and whose little cheeks were so aglow with heat that the crimson color could be seen even through the dark, sunburnt skin. And this was hardly to be wondered at, for in spite of the hot June sun, the child was clothed as if to keep off the bitterest frost. She did not look more than 5 years old, if as much, but what her natural figure was like, it would have been hard to say, for she had apparently 2, if not 3 dresses, one above the other, and over these a thick red woolen shawl wound round about her, so that the little body presented a shapeless appearance as, with its small feet shod in thick nailed mountain shoes, it slowly and laboriously plodded its way up in the heat. The 2 must have left the valley a good hour's walk behind them when they came to the hamlet known as Dorfli, which is situated halfway up the mountain. Here the wayfarers met with greetings from all sides, some calling to them from windows, some from open doors, others from outside, for the elder girl was now in her old home. She did not, however, pause in her walk to respond to her friends' welcoming cries and questions, but passed on without stopping for a moment until she reached the last of the scattered houses of the hamlet. Here a voice called to her from the door. "Wait a moment, Dete. If you are going up higher, I will come with you." The girl thus addressed stood still, and the child immediately let go her hand and seated herself on the ground. "Are you tired, Heidi?" asked her companion. "No, I am hot," answered the child. "We shall soon get to the top now. You must walk bravely on a little longer, and take good long steps, and in another hour we shall be there," said Dete in an encouraging voice. They were now joined by a stout, good-natured-looking woman, who walked on ahead with her old acquaintance, the 2 breaking forth at once into lively conversation about everybody and everything in Dorfli and its surroundings, while the child wandered behind them. "And where are you off to with the child?" asked the one who had just joined the party. I suppose it is the child your sister left." "Yes," answered Dete. "I am taking her up to uncle, where she must stay." "The child stay up there with Alm uncle? You must be out of your senses, Dete. How can you think of such a thing? The old man, however, will soon send you and your proposal packing off home again." "He cannot very well do that, seeing that he is her grandfather. He must do something for her. I have had the charge of the child till now, and I can tell you, Barble, I am not going to give up the chance which has just fallen to me of getting a good place, for her sake. It is for the grandfather now to do his duty by her." "That would be all very well if he were like other people," asserted stout Barble warmly. "But you know what he is, and what can he do with a child, especially with one so young? The child cannot possibly live with him. But where are you thinking of going yourself?" "To Frankfurt, where an extra good place awaits me," answered Dete. "The people I am going to were down at the baths last summer, and it was part of my duty to attend upon their rooms. They would have liked then to take me away with them, but I could not leave. Now they are there again, and have repeated their offer, and I intend to go with them. You may make up your mind to that." "I am glad I am not the child," exclaimed Barble, with a gesture of horrified pity. "Not a creature knows anything about the old man up there. He will have nothing to do with anybody, and never sets his foot inside a church from one year's end to another. When he does come down once in a while, everybody clears out of the way of him and his big stick. The mere sight of him, with his bushy grey eyebrows and his immense beard, is alarming enough. He looks like any old heathen or Indian, and few would care to meet him alone." "Well, and what of that?" said Dete, in a defiant voice. "He is the grandfather all the same, and must look after the child. He is not likely to do her any harm, and if he does, he will be answerable for it, not I." "I should very much like to know," continued Barble, in an inquiring tone of voice, "what the old man has on his conscience that he looks as he does, and lives up there on the mountain like a hermit, hardly ever allowing himself to be seen." "All kinds of things are said about him. You, Dete, however, must certainly have learnt a good deal concerning him from your sister. Am I not right?" "You are right, I did, but I am not going to repeat what I heard. If it should come to his ears, I should get into trouble about it." Now, Barble had for long past been most anxious to ascertain particulars about Alm uncle, as she could not understand why he seemed to feel such hatred towards his fellow creatures, and insisted on living all alone, or why people spoke about him half in whispers, as if afraid to say anything against him, and yet unwilling to take his part. Moreover, Barble was in ignorance as to why all the people in Dorfli called him Alm uncle, for he could not possibly be uncle to everybody living there. As, however, it was the custom, she did like the rest, and called the old man uncle. Barble had only lived in Dorfli since her marriage, which had taken place not long before. Previous to that her home had been below, in Prattigau, so that she was not well acquainted with all the events that had ever taken place, and with all the people who had ever lived in Dorfli and its neighbourhood. Dete, on the contrary, had been born in Dorfli, and had lived there with her mother until the death of the latter the year before, and had then gone over to the baths at Ragaz, and taken service in the large hotel there as chambermaid. On the morning of this day she had come all the way from Ragaz with the child, a friend having given them a lift in a hay-cart as far as Meienfeld. Barble was therefore determined not to lose this good opportunity of satisfying her curiosity. She put her arm through Dete's in a confidential sort of way, and said, "I know I can find out the real truth from you, and the meaning of all these tales that are afloat about him. I believe you know the whole story. Now, do just tell me what is wrong with the old man, and if he was always shunned as he is now, and was always such a misanthrope." "How can I possibly tell you whether he was always the same? seeing I am only 26, and he at least 70 years of age. So you can hardly expect me to know much about his youth. If I was sure, however, that what I tell you would not go the whole round of Prattigau, I could relate all kinds of things about him. My mother came from Domleschg, and so did he." "Nonsense, Data, what do you mean?" replied Barble, somewhat offended. "Gossip has not reached such a dreadful pitch in Prattigau as all that, and I am also quite capable of holding my tongue when it is necessary." "Very well, then, I will tell you, but just wait a moment," said Data, in a warning voice, and she looked back to make sure that the child was not near enough to hear all she was going to relate. But the child was nowhere to be seen, and must have turned aside from following her companions some time before, while these were too eagerly occupied with their conversation to notice it. Data stood still and looked around her in all directions. The footpath wound a little here and there, but could nevertheless be seen along its whole length, nearly to Dorfli. No one, however, was visible upon it at this moment. "I see where she is," exclaimed Barble. "Look over there." And she pointed to a spot far away from the footpath. "She is climbing up the slope yonder with the goatherd and his goats. I wonder why he is so late to-day in bringing them up. It happens well, however, for us, for he can now see after the child, and you can the better tell me your tale." "Oh, as to the looking after," remarked Data, "the boy need not put himself out about that. She is not by any means stupid for her 5 years, and knows how to use her eyes. She notices all that is going on, as I have often had occasion to remark, and this will stand her in good stead some day, for the old man has nothing beyond his 2 goats and his hut." "Did he ever have more?" asked Barble. "He? I should think so indeed," replied Data with animation. "He was owner once of one of the largest farms in Domleschg. He was the elder of 2 brothers. The younger was a quiet, orderly man, but nothing would please the other but to play the grand gentleman, and go driving about the country and mixing with bad company, strangers that nobody knew. He drank and gambled away the whole of his property, and when this became known to his mother and father, they died, one shortly after the other, of sorrow. The younger brother, who was also reduced to beggary, went off in his anger, no one knew whither, while uncle himself, having nothing now left to him but his bad name, also disappeared. For some time his whereabouts were unknown. Then some one found out that he had gone to Naples as a soldier. After that nothing more was heard of him for 12 or 15 years. At the end of that time he reappeared in Domleschg, bringing with him a young child, whom he tried to place with some of his kinspeople. Every door, however, was shut in his face, for no one wished to have any more to do with him. Embittered by this treatment, he vowed never to set foot in Domleschg again, and he then came to Dorfli, where he continued to live with his little boy. His wife was probably a native of the Grisons, whom he had met down there, and who died soon after their marriage. He could not have been entirely without money, for he apprenticed his son, Tobias, to a carpenter. He was a steady lad, and kindly received by every one in Dorfli. The old man was, however, still looked upon with suspicion, and it was even rumoured that he had been forced to make his escape from Naples, or it might have gone badly with him, for that he had killed a man, not in a fair fight, you understand, but in some brawl. We, however, did not refuse to acknowledge our relationship with him, my great-grandmother on my mother's side having been sister to his grandmother. So we called him uncle, and as through my father we are also related to nearly every family in Dorfli, he became known all over the place as uncle. And since he went to live on the mountain side, he has gone everywhere by the name of Alm Uncle. "And what happened to Tobias?" asked Barble, who was listening with deep interest. "Wait a moment, I am coming to that, but I cannot tell you everything at once," replied Data. Tobias was taught his trade in Mells, and when he had served his apprenticeship, came back to Dorfli and married my sister Adelheid. They had always been fond of one another, and they got on very well together after they were married. But their happiness did not last long. Her husband met with his death only 2 years after their marriage, a beam falling upon him as he was working, and killing him on the spot. They carried him home, and when Adelheid saw the poor disfigured body of her husband, she was so overcome with horror and grief that she fell into a fever, from which she never recovered. She had always been rather delicate, and subject to curious attacks, during which no one knew whether she was awake or sleeping. And so 2 months after Tobias had been carried to the grave, his wife followed him. Their sad fate was the talk of everybody far and near, and both in private and public the general opinion was expressed that it was a punishment which uncle had deserved for the godless life he had led. Some went so far even as to tell him so to his face. Our minister endeavoured to awaken his conscience, and exhorted him to repentance, but the old man grew only more wrathful and obdurate, and would not speak to a soul, and everyone did their best to keep out of his way. All at once we heard that he had gone to live up the Alm, and did not intend ever to come down again, and since then he has led his solitary life on the mountain-side, at enmity with God and man. Mother and I took Adelheid's little one, then only a year old, into our care. When mother died last year, and I went down to the baths to earn some money, I paid old Ursel, who lives in the village just above, to keep and look after the child. I stayed on at the baths through the winter, for as I could sew and knit, I had no difficulty in finding plenty of work, and early in the spring the same family I had waited on before returned from Frankfurt, and again asked me to go back with them. And so we leave the day after tomorrow, and I can assure you it is an excellent place for me." "And you are going to give the child over to the old man up there? It surprises me beyond words that you can think of doing such a thing, Dete," said Barbel, in a voice full of reproach. "What do you mean?" retorted Dete. "I have done my duty by the child, and what would you have me do with it now? I cannot certainly take a child of 5 years old with me to Frankfurt. But where are you going to yourself, Barbel? We are now halfway up the Alm." "We have just reached the place I wanted," answered Barbel. "I had something to say to the goatherd's wife, who does some spinning for me in the winter. So, good-bye, Dete, and good luck to you." Dete shook hands with her friend and remained standing, while Barbel went towards the small, dark-brown hut, which stood a few steps away from the path in a hollow that afforded it some protection from the mountain wind. The hut was situated halfway up the Alm, reckoning from Dorfli, and it was well that it was provided with some shelter, for it was so broken down and dilapidated that even then it must have been very unsafe as a habitation, for when the stormy south wind came sweeping over the mountain, everything inside it, doors and windows, shook and rattled, and all the rotten old beams creaked and trembled. On such days as this, had the goatherd's dwelling been standing above on the exposed mountain-side, it could not have escaped being blown straight down into the valley without a moment's warning. Here lived Peter, the 11-year-old boy who every morning went down to Dorfli to fetch his goats and drive them up onto the mountain, where they were free to browse till evening on the delicious mountain plants. Then Peter, with his light-footed animals, would go running and leaping down the mountain again until he reached Dorfli, and there he would give a shrill whistle through his fingers, whereupon all the owners of the goats would come out to fetch home the animals that belonged to them. It was generally the small boys and girls who ran in answer to Peter's whistle, for they were none of them afraid of the gentle goats, and this was the only hour of the day through all the summer months that Peter had any opportunity of seeing his young friends, since the rest of his time was spent alone with the goats. He had a mother and a blind grandmother at home, it is true, but he was always obliged to start off very early in the morning, and only got home late in the evening from Dorfli, for he always stayed as long as he could, talking and playing with the other children, and so he had just time enough at home, and that was all, to swallow down his bread and milk in the morning, and again in the evening to get through a similar meal, lie down in bed and go to sleep. His father, who had been known also as the goatherd, having earned his living as such when younger, had been accidentally killed while cutting wood some years before. His mother, whose real name was Brigitta, was always called the goatherd's wife, for the sake of old association, while the blind grandmother was just grandmother to all the old and young in the neighborhood. Dete had been standing for a good 10 minutes, looking about her in every direction for some sign of the children and the goats. Not a glimpse of them, however, was to be seen, so she climbed to a higher spot, whence she could get a fuller view of the mountain as it sloped beneath her to the valley, while, with ever-increasing anxiety on her face and in her movements, she continued to scan the surrounding slopes. Meanwhile the children were climbing up by a far and roundabout way, for Peter knew many spots where all kinds of good food, in the shape of shrubs and plants, grew for his goats, and he was in the habit of leading his flock aside from the beaten track. The child, exhausted with the heat and weight of her thick armor of clothes, panted and struggled after him at first with some difficulty. She said nothing, but her little eyes kept watching first Peter, as he sprang nimbly hither and thither on his bare feet, clad only in his short light breeches, and then the slim-legged goats that went leaping over rocks and shrubs and up the steep ascents with even greater ease. All at once she sat herself down on the ground, and as fast as her little fingers could move, began pulling off her shoes and stockings. This done, she rose, unwound the hot red shawl, and threw it away, and then proceeded to undo her frock. It was off in a second, but there was still another to unfasten, for Dete had put the Sunday frock on over the everyday one, to save the trouble of carrying it. Quick as lightning the everyday frock followed the other, and now the child stood up, clad only in her light, short-sleeved undergarment, stretching out her little bare arms with glee. She put all her clothes together in a tidy little heap, and then went jumping and climbing up after Peter and the goats as nimbly as any one of the party. Peter had taken no heed of what the child was about when she stayed behind, but when she ran up to him in her new attire, his face broke into a grin, which grew broader still as he looked back and saw the small heap of clothes lying on the ground, till his mouth stretched almost from ear to ear. He said nothing, however. The child, able now to move at her ease, began to enter into conversation with Peter, who had many questions to answer, for his companion wanted to know how many goats he had, where he was going to with them, and what he had to do when he arrived there. At last, after some time, they and the goats approached the hut, and came within view of Cousin Dete. Hardly had the latter caught sight of the little company climbing up towards her, when she shrieked out, "Heidi! What have you been doing? What a sight you have made of yourself! And where are your 2 frocks and the red wrapper? And the new shoes I bought, and the new stockings I knitted for you? Everything gone, not a thing left. What can you have been thinking of, Heidi? Where are all your clothes?" The child quietly pointed to a spot below on the mountain-side, and answered, "Down there." Dete followed the direction of her finger. She could just distinguish something lying on the ground, with a spot of red at the top of it, which she had no doubt was the woolen wrapper. "You good-for-nothing little thing!" exclaimed Dete angrily. "What could have put it into your head to do like that? What made you undress yourself? What do you mean by it?" "I don't want any clothes," said the child, not showing any sign of repentance for her past deed. "You wretched, thoughtless child, have you no sense in you at all?" continued Dete, scolding and lamenting. "Who is going all that way down to fetch them? It's a good half-hour's walk. Peter, you go off and fetch them for me as quickly as you can, and don't stand there gaping at me, as if you were rooted to the ground." "I am already past my time," answered Peter slowly, without moving from the spot where he had been standing with his hands in his pockets, listening to Data's outburst of dismay and anger. "Well, you won't get far if you only keep on standing there with your eyes staring out of your head," was Data's cross reply. "But see, you shall have something nice." And she held out a bright new piece of money to him that sparkled in the sun. Peter was immediately up and off down the steep mountainside, taking the shortest cut, and in an incredibly short space of time had reached the little heap of clothes, which he gathered up under his arm, and was back again so quickly that even Data was obliged to give him a word of praise as she handed him the promised money. Peter promptly thrust it into his pocket, and his face beamed with delight, for it was not often that he was the happy possessor of such riches. "You can carry the things up for me as far as Uncle's, as you are going the same way," went on Data, who was preparing to continue her climb up the mountain-side, which rose in a steep ascent immediately behind the goatherd's hut. Peter willingly undertook to do this, and followed after her on his bare feet, with his left arm round the bundle, and the right swinging his goatherd's stick, while Heidi and the goats went skipping and jumping joyfully beside him. After a climb of more than 3/4 of an hour, they reached the top of the Alm mountain. Uncle's hut stood on a projection of the rock, exposed indeed to the winds, but where every ray of sun could rest upon it, and a full view could be had of the valley beneath. Behind the hut stood 3 old fir trees, with long, thick, unlopped branches. Beyond these rose a further wall of mountain, the lower heights still overgrown with beautiful grass and plants, above which were stonier slopes, covered only with scrub, that led gradually up to the steep, bare, rocky summits. Against the hut, on the side looking towards the valley, Uncle had put up a seat. Here he was sitting, his pipe in his mouth and his hands on his knees, quietly looking out, when the children, the goats, and Cousin Data suddenly clambered into view. Heidi was at the top first. She went straight up to the old man, put out her hand, and said, "Good evening, grandfather." So, what is the meaning of this?" he asked gruffly, as he gave the child an abrupt shake of the hand, and gazed long and scrutinizingly at her from under his bushy eyebrows. Heidi stared steadily back at him in return with unflinching gaze, for the grandfather, with his long beard and thick grey eyebrows that grew together over his nose and looked just like a bush, was such a remarkable appearance that Heidi was unable to take her eyes off him. Meanwhile Data had come up, with Peter after her, and the latter now stood still a while to watch what was going on. "I wish you good day, Uncle," said Data, as she walked towards him. "And I have brought you Tobias and Adelheide's child. You will hardly recognize her, as you have never seen her since she was a year old." "And what has the child to do with me up here?" asked the old man curtly. "You there," he then called out to Peter. "Be off with your goats. You are none too early as it is, and take mine with you." Peter obeyed on the instant, and quickly disappeared, for the old man had given him a look that made him feel that he did not want to stay any longer. "The child is here to remain with you," Data made answer. "I have, I think, done my duty by her for these 4 years, and now it is time for you to do yours." "That's it, is it?" said the old man, as he looked at her with a flash in his eye. "And when the child begins to fret and whine after you, as is the way with these unreasonable little beings, what am I to do with her then?" "That's your affair," retorted Data. "I know I had to put up with her without complaint when she was left on my hands, as an infant, and with enough to do as it was for my mother and self. Now I have to go and look after my own earnings, and you are the next of kin to the child. If you cannot arrange to keep her, do with her as you like. You will be answerable for the result if harm happens to her, though you have hardly need, I should think, to add to the burden already on your conscience." Now, Dete was not quite easy in her own conscience about what she was doing, and consequently was feeling hot and irritable, and said more than she had intended. As she uttered her last words, Uncle rose from his seat. He looked at her in a way that made her draw back a step or two. Then, flinging out his arm, he said to her in a commanding voice, "Be off with you this instant, and get back as quickly as you can to the place whence you came, and do not let me see your face again in a hurry." Dete did not wait to be told twice. "Good-bye to you, then, and to you too, Heidi," she called, as she turned quickly away and started to descend the mountain at a running pace, which she did not slacken till she found herself safely again at Dorfli, for some inward agitation drove her forwards as if a steam-engine was at work inside her. Again questions came raining down upon her from all sides, for every one knew Dete, as well as all particulars of the birth and former history of the child, and all wondered what she had done with it. From every door and window came voices calling, "Where is the child? Where have you left the child, Dete?" And more reluctantly Dete made answer, "Up there with Alm Uncle. With Alm Uncle, have I not told you so already?" Then the women began to hurl reproaches at her. First one cried out, "How could you do such a thing?" Then another, "To think of leaving a helpless little thing up there," while again and again came the words, "The poor mite, the poor mite," pursuing her as she went along. Unable at last to bear it any longer, Dete ran forward as fast as she could until she was beyond reach of their voices. She was far from happy at the thought of what she had done, for the child had been left in her care by her dying mother. She quieted herself, however, with the idea that she would be able to do something for the child if she was earning plenty of money, and it was a relief to her to think that she would soon be far away from all these people who were making such a fuss about the matter, and she rejoiced further still that she was at liberty now to take such a good place. End of Chapter 1. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 1st, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi, Chapter 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org. Heidi, by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 2. At Home with Grandfather. As soon as Dete had disappeared, the old man went back to his bench, and there he remained seated, staring on the ground without uttering a sound, while thick curls of smoke floated upward from his pipe. Heidi, meanwhile, was enjoying herself in her new surroundings. She looked about till she found a shed, built against the hut, where the goats were kept. She peeped in, and saw it was empty. She continued her search, and presently came to the fir trees behind the hut. A strong breeze was blowing through them, and there was a rushing and roaring in their topmost branches. Heidi stood still and listened. The sound growing fainter, she went on again to the farther corner of the hut, and so round to where her grandfather was sitting. Seeing that he was in exactly the same position as when she left him, she went and placed herself in front of the old man, and, putting her hands behind her back, stood and gazed at him. Her grandfather looked up, and as she continued standing there without moving, "What is it you want?" he asked. "I want to see what you have inside the house," said Heidi. "Come, then." And the grandfather rose and went before her towards the hut. "Bring your bundle of clothes in with you," he bid her as she was following. "I shan't want them any more," was her prompt answer. The old man turned and looked searchingly at the child, whose dark eyes were sparkling in delighted anticipation of what she was going to see inside. "She is certainly not wanting in intelligence," he murmured to himself. "And "Why shall you not want them any more?" he asked aloud. "Because I want to go about like the goats, with their thin, light legs." "Well, you can do so if you like," said her grandfather. "But bring the things in. We must put them in the cupboard." Heidi did as she was told. The old man now opened the door, and Heidi stepped inside after him. She found herself in a good-sized room, which covered the whole ground floor of the hut. A table and a chair were the only furniture. In one corner stood the grandfather's bed. In another was the hearth, with a large kettle hanging above it, and on the further side was a large door in the wall. This was the cupboard. The grandfather opened it. Inside were his clothes, some hanging up, others, a couple of shirts and some socks and handkerchiefs, lying on a shelf. On a second shelf were some plates and cups and glasses, and on a higher one still, a round loaf, smoked meat, and cheese. For everything that Alm Uncle needed for his food and clothing was kept in this cupboard. Heidi, as soon as it was opened, ran quickly forward and thrust in her bundle of clothes, as far back behind her grandfather's things as possible, so that they might not easily be found again. She then looked carefully round the room and asked, "Where am I to sleep, grandfather?" "Wherever you like," he answered. Heidi was delighted, and began at once to examine all the nooks and corners to find out where it would be pleasantest to sleep. In the corner near her grandfather's bed she saw a short ladder against the wall. Up she climbed, and found herself in the hay-loft. There lay a large heap of fresh, sweet-smelling hay, while through a round window in the wall she could see right down the valley. "I shall sleep up here, grandfather," she called down to him. "It's lovely up here. Come up and see how lovely it is." "Oh, I know all about it," he called up in answer. "I am getting the bed ready now," she called down again, as she went busily to and fro at her work. "But I shall want you to bring me up a sheet. You can't have a bed without a sheet. You want it to lie upon." "All right," said the grandfather, and presently he went to the cupboard, and after rummaging about inside for a few minutes he drew out a long, coarse piece of stuff, which was all he had to do duty for a sheet. He carried it up to the loft, where he found Heidi had already made quite a nice bed. She had put an extra heap of hay at one end for a pillow, and had so arranged it that, when in bed, she would be able to see comfortably out through the round window. "That is capital," said her grandfather. "Now we must put on the sheet, but wait a moment first." And he went and fetched another large bundle of hay to make the bed thicker, so that the child should not feel the hard floor under her. "There, now bring it here." Heidi had got hold of the sheet, but it was almost too heavy for her to carry. This was a good thing, however, as the close, thick stuff would prevent the sharp stalks of the hay running through and pricking her. The two together now spread the sheet over the bed, and where it was too long or too broad, Heidi quickly tucked it in under the hay. It looked now as tidy and comfortable a bed as you could wish for, and Heidi stood gazing thoughtfully at her handiwork. "We have forgotten something now, grandfather," she said after a short silence. "What's that?" he asked. "A coverlet. When you get into bed, you have to creep in between the sheets and the coverlet." "Oh, that's the way, is it? But suppose I have not got a coverlet," said the old man. "Well, never mind, grandfather," said Heidi in a consoling tone of voice. "I can take some more hay to put over me." And she was turning quickly to fetch another armful from the heap, when her grandfather stopped her. "Wait a moment," he said, and he climbed down the ladder again and went towards his bed. He returned to the loft with a large thick sack made of flax, which he threw down, exclaiming, "There, that is better than hay, is it not?" Heidi began tugging away at the sack with all her little might, in her efforts to get it smooth and straight, but her small hands were not fitted for so heavy a job. Her grandfather came to her assistance, and when they had got it tidily spread over the bed, it all looked so nice and warm and comfortable that Heidi stood gazing at it in delight. "That is a splendid coverlet," she said, "and the bed looks lovely altogether. I wish it was night, so that I might get inside it at once." "I think we might have something to eat first," said the grandfather. "What do you think?" Heidi, in the excitement of bed-making, had forgotten everything else, but now when she began to think about food she felt terribly hungry, for she had had nothing to eat since the piece of bread and little cup of thin coffee that had been her breakfast early that morning, before starting on her long, hot journey. So she answered without hesitation, "Yes, I think so too." "Let us go down, then, as we both think alike," said the old man, and he followed the child down the ladder. Then he went up to the hearth, pushed the big kettle aside, and drew forward the little one that was hanging on the chain, and seating himself on the round-topped, three-legged stool before the fire, blew it up into a clear, bright flame. The kettle soon began to boil, and meanwhile the old man held a large piece of cheese on a long iron fork over the fire, turning it round and round till it was toasted a nice golden yellow color on each side. Heidi watched all that was going on with eager curiosity. Suddenly some new idea seemed to come into her head, for she turned and ran to the cupboard, and then began going busily backwards and forwards. Presently the grandfather got up and came to the table with a jug and the cheese, and there he saw it already tidily laid, with the round loaf and 2 plates and 2 knives, each in its right place, for Heidi had taken exact note that morning of all that there was in the cupboard, and she knew which things would be wanted for their meal. "Ah, that's right," said the grandfather. "I am glad to see that you have some ideas of your own." And as he spoke he laid the toasted cheese on a layer of bread. "But there is still something missing." Heidi looked at the jug that was steaming away invitingly, and ran quickly back to the cupboard. At first she could only see a small bowl left on the shelf, but she was not long in perplexity, for a moment later she caught sight of 2 glasses further back, and without an instant's loss of time she returned with these and the bowl, and put them down on the table. "Good. I see you know how to set about things, but what will you do for a seat?" The grandfather himself was sitting on the only chair in the room. Heidi flew to the hearth, and dragging the 3-legged stool up to the table, sat herself down upon it. "Well, you have managed to find a seat for yourself, I see, only rather a low one, I am afraid," said the grandfather. "But you would not be tall enough to reach the table, even if you sat in my chair. The first thing now, however, is to have something to eat, so come along." With that he stood up, filled the bowl with milk, and placing it on the chair, pushed it in front of Heidi on her little 3-legged stool, so that she now had a table to herself. Then he brought her a large slice of bread and a piece of the golden cheese, and told her to eat. After which he went and sat down on the corner of the table, and began his own meal. Heidi lifted the bowl with both hands, and drank without pause till it was empty, for the thirst of all her long, hot journey had returned upon her. Then she drew a deep breath. In the eagerness of her thirst she had not stopped to breathe, and put down the bowl. "Was the milk nice?" asked her grandfather. "I never drank any so good before," answered Heidi. "Then you must have some more," and the old man filled her bowl again to the brim, and set it before the child, who was now hungrily beginning her bread, having first spread it with the cheese, which, after being toasted, was soft as butter. The 2 together tasted deliciously, and the child looked the picture of content as she sat eating, and at intervals taking further draughts of milk. The meal being over, the grandfather went outside to put the goat shed in order, and Heidi watched with interest while he first swept it out, and then put fresh straw for the goats to sleep upon. Then he went to the little well shed, and there he cut some long round sticks and a small round board. In this he bored some holes, and stuck the sticks into them, and there, as if by magic, was a three-legged stool just like her grandfather's, only higher. Heidi stood and looked at it, speechless with astonishment. "What do you think that is?" asked her grandfather. "It's my stool, I know, because it is such a high one, and it was made all of a minute," said the child, still lost in wonder and admiration. "She understands what she sees. Her eyes are in the right place," remarked the grandfather to himself, as he continued his way round the hut, knocking in a nail here and there, or making fast some part of the door, and so with hammer and nails and pieces of wood going from spot to spot, mending or clearing away wherever work of the kind was needed. Heidi followed him step by step, her eyes attentively taking in all that he did, and everything that she saw was a fresh source of pleasure to her. And so the time passed happily on till evening. Then the wind began to roar louder than ever through the old fir trees. Heidi listened with delight to the sound, and it filled her heart so full of gladness that she skipped and danced round the old trees, as if some unheard-of joy had come to her. The grandfather stood and watched her from the shed. Suddenly a shrill whistle was heard. Heidi paused in her dancing, and the grandfather came out. Down from the heights above, the goats came springing one after another, with Peter in their midst. Heidi sprang forward with a cry of joy, and rushed among the flock, greeting first one and then another of her old friends of the morning. As they neared the hut, the goats stood still, and then two of their number, two beautiful slender animals, one white and one brown, ran forward to where the grandfather was standing, and began licking his hands, for he was holding a little salt, which he always had ready for his goats on their return home. Peter disappeared with the remainder of his flock. Heidi tenderly stroked the two goats in turn, running first to one side of them and then the other, and jumping about in her glee at the pretty little animals. "Are they ours, grandfather? Are they both ours? Are you going to put them in the shed? Will they always stay with us?" Heidi's questions came tumbling out one after the other, so that her grandfather had only time to answer each of them with, "Yes, yes." When the goats had finished licking up the salt, her grandfather told her to go and fetch her bowl and the bread. Heidi obeyed, and was soon back again. The grandfather milked the white goat and filled her basin, and then breaking off a piece of bread, "Now eat your supper," he said, "and then go up to bed. Cousin Data left another little bundle for you with a nightgown and other small things in it, which you will find at the bottom of the cupboard if you want them. I must go and shut up the goats, so be off and sleep well." "Good night, grandfather, good night. What are their names, grandfather? What are their names?" she called out as she ran after his retreating figure and the goats. "The white one is named Schwenli, and the brown one Barely," he answered. "Good night, Schwenli, good night, Barely," she called again at the top of her voice, for they were already inside the shed. Then she sat down on the seat and began to eat and drink, but the wind was so strong that it almost blew her away, so she made haste and finished her supper, and then went indoors and climbed up to her bed, where she was soon lying as sweetly and soundly asleep as any young princess on her couch of silk. Not long after, and while it was still twilight, the grandfather also went to bed, for he was up every morning at sunrise, and the sun came climbing up over the mountains at a very early hour during these summer months. The wind grew so tempestuous during the night, and blew in such gusts against the walls, that the hut trembled, and the old beams groaned and creaked. It came howling and wailing down the chimney like voices of those in pain, and it raged with such fury among the old fir-trees that here and there a branch was snapped and fell. In the middle of the night the old man got up. "The child will be frightened," he murmured half aloud. He mounted the ladder and went and stood by the child's bed. Outside the moon was struggling with the dark, fast-driving clouds, which at one moment left it clear and shining, and the next swept over it, and all again was dark. Just now the moonlight was falling through the round window straight on to Heidi's bed. She lay under the heavy coverlet, her cheeks rosy with sleep, her head peacefully resting on her little round arm, and with a happy expression on her baby face, as if dreaming of something pleasant. The old man stood looking down on the sleeping child until the moon again disappeared behind the clouds, and he could see no more. Then he went back to bed. End of Chapter 2. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 4th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi, Chapter 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 3. Out with the Goats. Heidi was awakened early the next morning by a loud whistle. The sun was shining through the round window, and falling in golden rays on her bed and on the large heap of hay, and as she opened her eyes everything in the loft seemed gleaming with gold. She looked around her in astonishment, and could not imagine for a while where she was. But her grandfather's deep voice was now heard outside, and then Heidi began to recall all that had happened, how she had come away from her former home and was now on the mountain with her grandfather, instead of with old Ursula. The latter was nearly stone-deaf, and always felt cold, so that she sat all day either by the hearth in the kitchen or by the sitting-room stove, and Heidi had been obliged to stay close to her, for the old woman was so deaf that she could not tell where the child was, if out of her sight. And Heidi, shut up within the four walls, had often longed to be out of doors. So she felt very happy this morning as she woke up in her new home, and remembered all the many new things that she had seen the day before, and which she would see again that day, and above all she thought with delight of the 2 dear goats. Heidi jumped quickly out of bed, and a very few minutes sufficed her to put on the clothes which she had taken off the night before, for there were not many of them. Then she climbed down the ladder and ran outside the hut. There stood Peter already with his flock of goats, and the grandfather was just bringing his 2 out of the shed to join the others. Heidi ran forward to wish good morning to him and the goats. "Do you want to go with them on to the mountain?" asked her grandfather. Nothing could have pleased Heidi better, and she jumped for joy in answer. "But you must first wash and make yourself tidy. The sun that shines so brightly overhead will else laugh at you for being dirty. See, I have put everything ready for you." And her grandfather pointed as he spoke to a large tub full of water, which stood in the sun before the door. Heidi ran to it, and began splashing and rubbing, till she quite glistened with cleanliness. The grandfather meanwhile went inside the hut, calling to Peter to follow him and bring in his wallet. Peter obeyed with astonishment, and laid down the little bag which held his meagre dinner. "Open it," said the old man, and inside it he put a large piece of bread, and an equally large piece of cheese, which made Peter open his eyes, for each was twice the size of the 2 portions which he had for his own dinner. "There, now there is only the little bowl to add," continued the grandfather. for the child cannot drink her milk as you do from the goat. She is not accustomed to that. You must milk 2 bowlfuls for her when she has her dinner, for she is going with you, and will remain with you till you return this evening. But take care she does not fall over any of the rocks, do you hear?" Heidi now came running in. "Will the sun laugh at me now, grandfather?" she asked anxiously. Her grandfather had left a coarse towel hanging up for her near the tub, and with this she had so thoroughly scrubbed her face, arms, and neck, for fear of the sun, that as she stood there she was as red all over as a lobster. He gave a little laugh. "No, there is nothing for him to laugh at now," he assured her. "But I tell you what, when you come home this evening you will have to get right into the tub, like a fish, for if you run about like the goats you will get your feet dirty. Now you can be off." She started joyfully for the mountain. During the night the wind had blown away all the clouds, the dark blue sky was spreading overhead, and in its midst was the bright sun, shining down on the green slopes of the mountain, where the flowers opened their little blue and yellow cups, and looked up to him smiling. Heidi went running hither and thither and shouting with delight, for here were whole patches of delicate red primroses, and there the blue gleam of the lovely gentian, while above them all laughed and nodded the tender-leaved golden cistus. Enchanted with all this waving field of brightly colored flowers, Heidi forgot even Peter and the goats. She ran on in front, and then off to the side, tempted first one way and then the other, as she caught sight of some bright spot of glowing red or yellow. And all the while she was plucking whole handfuls of the flowers, which she put into her little apron, for she wanted to take them all home and stick them in the hay, so that she might make her bedroom look just like the meadows outside. Peter had therefore to be on the alert, and his round eyes, which did not move very quickly, had more work than they could well manage, for the goats were as lively as Heidi. They ran in all directions, and Peter had to follow, whistling and calling, and swinging his stick to get all the runaways together again. "Where have you got to now, Heidi?" he called out somewhat crossly. "Here," called back a voice from somewhere. Peter could see no one, for Heidi was seated on the ground at the foot of a small hill, thickly overgrown with sweet-smelling prunella. The whole air seemed filled with its fragrance, and Heidi thought she had never smelt anything so delicious. She sat surrounded by the flowers, drawing in deep breaths of the scented air. "Come along here," called Peter again. "You are not to fall over the rocks. Your grandfather gave orders that you were not to do so." "Where are the rocks?" asked Heidi, answering him back. But she did not move from her seat, for the scent of the flowers seemed sweeter to her with every breath of wind that wafted it towards her. "Up above, right up above. We have a long way to go yet, so come along. And on the topmost peak of all the old bird of prey sits and croaks." That did it. Heidi immediately sprang to her feet and ran up to Peter with her apron full of flowers. "You have got enough now," said the boy, as they began climbing up again together. "You will stay here forever if you go on picking, and if you gather all the flowers now, there will be none for tomorrow." This last argument seemed a convincing one to Heidi, and moreover her apron was already so full that there was hardly room for another flower, and it would never do to leave nothing to pick for another day. So she now kept with Peter, and the goats also became more orderly in their behavior, for they were beginning to smell the plants they loved that grew on the higher slopes, and clambered up now without pause in their anxiety to reach them. The spot where Peter generally halted for his goats to pasture, and where he took up his quarters for the day, lay at the foot of the high rocks, which were covered for some distance up by bushes and fir trees, beyond which rose their bare and rugged summits. On one side of the mountain the rock was split into deep clefts, and the grandfather had reason to warn Peter of danger. Having climbed as far as the halting-place, Peter unslung his wallet and put it carefully in a little hollow of the ground, for he knew what the wind was like up there, and did not want to see his precious belongings sent rolling down the mountain by a sudden gust. Then he threw himself at full length on the warm ground, for he was tired after all his exertions. Heidi, meanwhile, had unfastened her apron, and rolling it carefully round the flowers, laid it beside Peter's wallet inside the hollow. She then sat down beside his outstretched figure, and looked about her. The valley lay far below, bathed in the morning sun. In front of her rose a broad snow-field, high against the dark blue sky, while to the left was a huge pile of rocks, on either side of which a bare lofty peak, that seemed to pierce the blue, looked frowningly down upon her. The child sat without moving, her eyes taking in the whole scene, and all around was a great stillness, only broken by soft, light puffs of wind that swayed the light bells of the blue flowers, and the shining gold heads of the cistus, and set them nodding merrily on their slender stems. Peter had fallen asleep after his fatigue, and the goats were climbing about among the bushes overhead. Heidi had never felt so happy in her life before. She drank in the golden sunlight, the fresh air, the sweet smell of the flowers, and wished for nothing better than to remain there forever. So the time went on, while to Heidi, who had so often looked up from the valley at the mountains above, these seemed now to have faces, and to be looking down at her like old friends. Suddenly she heard a loud, harsh cry overhead, and lifting her eyes she saw a bird, larger than any she had ever seen before, with great spreading wings, wheeling round and round in wide circles, and uttering a piercing, croaking kind of sound above her. "Peter, Peter, wake up!" called out Heidi. "See, the great bird is there. Look, look!" Peter got up on hearing her call, and together they sat and watched the bird, which rose higher and higher in the blue air, till it disappeared behind the grey mountain tops. "Where has it gone to?" asked Heidi, who had followed the bird's movements with intense interest. "Home to its nest," said Peter. "Is his home right up there? Oh, how nice to be up so high! Why does he make that noise?" "Because he can't help it," explained Peter. "Let us climb up there and see where his nest is," proposed Heidi. "Oh, oh, oh!" exclaimed Peter, his disapproval of Heidi's suggestion becoming more marked with each ejaculation. "Why, even the goats cannot climb as high as that. Besides, didn't Uncle say that you were not to fall over the rocks?" Peter now began suddenly whistling and calling in such a loud manner that Heidi could not think what was happening. But the goats evidently understood his voice, for one after the other they came springing down the rocks, until they were all assembled on the green plateau, some continuing to nibble at the juicy stems, others skipping about here and there, or pushing at each other with their horns for pastime. Heidi jumped up and ran in and out among them, for it was new to her to see the goats playing together like this, and her delight was beyond words as she joined in their frolics. She made personal acquaintance with them all in turn, for they were like separate individuals to her, each single goat having a particular way of behavior of its own. Meanwhile Peter had taken the wallet out of the hollow, and placed the pieces of bread and cheese on the ground in the shape of a square, the larger two on Heidi's side, and the smaller on his own, for he knew exactly which were hers and which his. Then he took the little bowl, and milked some delicious fresh milk into it from the white goat, and afterwards set the bowl in the middle of the square. Now he called Heidi to come, but she wanted more calling than the goats, for the child was so excited and amused at the capers and lively games of her new playfellows, that she saw and heard nothing else. But Peter knew how to make himself heard, for he shouted till the very rocks above echoed his voice, and at last Heidi appeared, and when she saw the inviting repast spread out upon the ground, she went skipping round it for joy. "Leave off jumping about, it is time for dinner," said Peter. "Sit down now and begin." Heidi sat down. "Is the milk for me?" she asked, giving another look of delight at the beautifully arranged square, with the bowl as a chief ornament in the centre. "Yes," replied Peter, "and the 2 large pieces of bread and cheese are yours also, and when you have drunk up that milk, you are to have another bowlful from the white goat, and then it will be my turn." "And which do you get your milk from?" inquired Heidi. "From my own goat, the piebald one. But go on now with your dinner," said Peter, again reminding her it was time to eat. Heidi now took up the bowl and drank her milk, and as soon as she had put it down empty, Peter rose and filled it again for her. Then she broke off a piece of her bread and held out the remainder, which was still larger than Peter's own piece, together with the whole big slice of cheese, to her companion, saying, "You can have that. I have plenty." Peter looked at Heidi, unable to speak for astonishment, for never in all his life could he have said and done like that with anything he had. He hesitated a moment, for he could not believe that Heidi was in earnest, but the latter kept on holding out the bread and cheese, and as Peter still did not take it, she laid it down on his knees. He saw then that she really meant it. He seized the food, nodded his thanks and acceptance of her present, and then made a more splendid meal than he had known ever since he was a goatherd. Heidi the while still continued to watch the goats. "Tell me all their names," she said. Peter knew these by heart, for having very little else to carry in his head, he had no difficulty in remembering them. So he began, telling Heidi the name of each goat in turn as he pointed it out to her. Heidi listened with great attention, and it was not long before she could herself distinguish the goats from one another, and could call each by name, for every goat had its own peculiarities, which could not easily be mistaken, only one had to watch them closely, and this Heidi did. There was the great Turk with his big horns, who was always wanting to butt the others, so that most of them ran away when they saw him coming, and would have nothing to do with their rough companion. Only Distelfink, the slender, nimble little goat, was brave enough to face him, and would make a rush at him 3 or 4 times in succession, with such agility and dexterity that the great Turk often stood still, quite astounded, not venturing to attack her again, for Distelfink was fronting him, prepared for more warlike action, and her horns were sharp. Then there was little Schneehopli, who bleated in such a plaintive and beseeching manner that Heidi already had several times run to it, and taken its head in her hands to comfort it. Just at this moment the pleading young cry was heard again, and Heidi jumped up running, and, putting her arms round the little creature's neck, asked in a sympathetic voice, "What is it, little Schneehopli? Why do you call like that, as if in trouble?" The goat pressed closer to Heidi in a confiding way, and left off bleating. Peter called out from where he was sitting, for he had not yet got to the end of his bread and cheese, "She cries like that because the old goat is not with her. She was sold at Maienfeld the day before yesterday, and so will not come up the mountain any more." "Who is the old goat?" called Heidi back. "Why, her mother, of course," was the answer. "Where is the grandmother?" called Heidi again. "She has none." "And the grandfather?" "She has none." "Oh, you poor little Schneehopli!" exclaimed Heidi, clasping the animal gently to her. "But do not cry like that any more. See now, I shall come up here with you every day, so that you will not be alone any more, and if you want anything, you have only to come to me." The young animal rubbed its head contentedly against Heidi's shoulder, and no longer gave such plaintive bleats. Peter, now having finished his meal, joined Heidi and the goats, Heidi having by this time found out a great many things about these. She had decided that by far the handsomest and best behaved of the goats were undoubtedly the two belonging to her grandfather. They carried themselves with a certain air of distinction, and generally went their own way, and as to the great Turk, they treated him with indifference and contempt. The goats were now beginning to climb the rocks again, each seeking for the plants it liked in its own fashion, some jumping over everything they met till they found what they wanted, others going more carefully and cropping all the nice leaves by the way, the Turk still now and then giving the others a poke with his horns. Schwenli and Barely clambered lightly up and never failed to find the best bushes, and then they would stand gracefully poised on their pretty legs, delicately nibbling at the leaves. Heidi stood with her hands behind her back, carefully noting all they did. "Peter," she said to the boy who had again thrown himself down on the ground, "the prettiest of all the goats are Schwenli and Barely." "Yes, I know they are," was the answer. "Alm uncle brushes them down and washes them and gives them salt, and he has the nicest shed for them." All of a sudden Peter leaped to his feet and ran hastily after the goats. Heidi followed him as fast as she could, for she was too eager to know what had happened to stay behind. Peter dashed through the middle of the flock towards that side of the mountain where the rocks fell perpendicularly to a great depth below, and where any thoughtless goat, if it went too near, might fall over and break all its legs. He had caught sight of the inquisitive Distelfink taking leaps in that direction, and he was only just in time, for the animal had already sprung to the edge of the abyss. All Peter could do was to throw himself down and seize one of her hind legs. Distelfink, thus taken by surprise, began bleating furiously, angry at being held so fast, and prevented from continuing her voyage of discovery. She struggled to get loose, and endeavored so obstinately to leap forward that Peter shouted to Heidi to come and help him, for he could not get up and was afraid of pulling out the goat's leg altogether. Heidi had already run up, and she saw at once the danger both Peter and the animal were in. She quickly gathered a bunch of sweet-smelling leaves, and then, holding them under Distelfink's nose, said coaxingly, "Come, come, Distelfink, you must not be naughty. Look, you might fall down there and break your leg, and that would give you dreadful pain." The young animal turned quickly, and began contentedly eating the leaves out of Heidi's hand. Meanwhile Peter got on to his feet again, and took hold of Distelfink by the band round her neck, from which her bell was hung, and Heidi taking hold of her in the same way on the other side, they led the wanderer back to the rest of the flock that had remained peacefully feeding. Peter, now he had his goat in safety, lifted his stick in order to give her a good beating as punishment, and Distelfink, seeing what was coming, shrank back in fear. But Heidi cried out, "No, no, Peter, you must not strike her. See how frightened she is." "She deserves it," growled Peter, and again lifted his stick. Then Heidi flung herself against him and cried indignantly, "You have no right to touch her. It will hurt her. Let her alone." Peter looked with surprise at the commanding little figure, whose dark eyes were flashing, and reluctantly he let his stick drop. "Well, I will let her off if you will give me some more of your cheese tomorrow," he said, for he was determined to have something to make up to him for his fright. "You shall have it all, tomorrow and every day. I do not want it," replied Heidi, giving ready consent to his demand. "And I will give you bread as well, a large piece like you had today, but then you must promise never to beat Distelfink or Schneehopli or any of the goats." "All right," said Peter. "I don't care," which meant that he would agree to the bargain. He now let go of Distelfink, who joyfully sprang to join her companions. And thus imperceptibly the day had crept on to its close, and now the sun was on the point of sinking out of sight behind the high mountains. Heidi was again sitting on the ground, silently gazing at the blue bell-shaped flowers as they glistened in the evening sun, for a golden light lay on the grass and flowers, and the rocks above were beginning to shine and glow. All at once she sprang to her feet. "Peter, Peter, everything is on fire! All the rocks are burning, and the great snow mountain and the sky! Oh, look, look! The high rock up there is red with flame! Oh, the beautiful fiery snow! Stand up, Peter! See, the fire has reached the great bird's nest! Look at the rocks! Look at the fir trees! Everything, everything is on fire!" "It is always like that," said Peter composedly, continuing to peel his stick. "But it is not really fire." "What is it, then?" cried Heidi, as she ran backwards and forwards to look first one side and then the other, for she felt she could not have enough of such a beautiful sight. "What is it, Peter? What is it?" she repeated. "It gets like that of itself," explained Peter. "Look, look!" cried Heidi in fresh excitement. "Now they have turned all rose color. Look at that one covered with snow, and that with the high pointed rocks. What do you call them?" "Mountains have not any names," he answered. "Oh, how beautiful! Look at the crimson snow, and up there on the rocks there are ever so many roses. Oh, now they are turning gray. Oh, oh, now all the color has died away. It's all gone, Peter." And Heidi sat down on the ground, looking as full of distress as if everything had really come to an end. "It will come again tomorrow," said Peter. "Get up, we must go home now." He whistled to his goats, and together they all started on their homeward way. "Is it like that every day? Shall we see it every day when we bring the goats up here?" asked Heidi, as she clambered down the mountain at Peter's side. She waited eagerly for his answer, hoping that he would tell her it was so. "It is like that most days," he replied. "But will it be like that tomorrow for certain?" Heidi persisted. "Yes, yes, tomorrow for certain," Peter assured her in answer. Heidi now felt quite happy again, and her little brain was so full of new impressions and new thoughts that she did not speak any more until they had reached the hut. The grandfather was sitting under the fir trees, where he had also put up a seat, waiting as usual for his goats, which returned down the mountain on this side. Heidi ran up to him, followed by the white and brown goats, for they knew their own master and stall. Peter called out after her, "Come with me again tomorrow. Good night," for he was anxious for more than one reason that Heidi should go with him the next day. Heidi ran back quickly and gave Peter her hand, promising to go with him, and then making her way through the goats, she once more clasped Schneehöppli round the neck, saying in a gentle, soothing voice, "Sleep well, Schneehöppli, and remember that I shall be with you again tomorrow, so you must not bleat so sadly any more." Schneehöppli gave her a friendly and grateful look, and then went leaping joyfully after the other goats. Heidi returned to the fir trees. "Oh, grandfather!" she cried, even before she had come up to him. "It was so beautiful! The fire and the roses on the rocks, and the blue and yellow flowers, and look what I have brought you!" And opening the apron that held her flowers, she shook them all out at her grandfather's feet. But the poor flowers, how changed they were! Heidi hardly knew them again. They looked like dry bits of hay. Not a single little flower cup stood open. "Oh, grandfather, what is the matter with them?" exclaimed Heidi in shocked surprise. "They were not like that this morning. Why do they look so now?" "They like to stand out there in the sun and not be shut up in an apron," said her grandfather. "Then I will never gather any more. But, grandfather, why did the great bird go on croaking so?" she continued in an eager tone of inquiry. "Go along now and get into your bath, while I go and get some milk. When we are together at supper, I will tell you all about it." Heidi obeyed, and when later she was sitting on her high stool before her milk bowl, with her grandfather beside her, she repeated her question. "Why does the great bird go on croaking and screaming down at us, grandfather?" He is mocking at the people who live down below in the villages, because they all go huddling and gossiping together, and encourage one another in evil talking and deeds. He calls out, 'If you would separate and each go your own way, and come up here and live on a height as I do, it would be better for you.'" There was almost a wildness in the old man's voice as he spoke, so that Heidi seemed to hear the croaking of the bird again, even more distinctly. "Why haven't the mountains any names?" Heidi went on. "They have names," answered her grandfather, "and if you can describe one of them to me that I know, I will tell you what it is called." Heidi then described to him the rocky mountain with the 2 high peaks, so exactly that the grandfather was delighted. "Just so, I know it. It is called Falkness. Did you see any other?" Then Heidi told him of the mountain with the great snow field, and how it had been on fire, and had turned rosy red, and then all of a sudden had grown quite pale again, and all the color had disappeared. "I know that one too," he said. "That is the Skese Plana. So you enjoyed being out with the goats?" Then Heidi went on to give him an account of the whole day, and of how delightful it had all been, and particularly described the fire that had burst out everywhere in the evening. And then nothing would do but her grandfather must tell how it came, for Peter knew nothing about it. The grandfather explained to her that it was the sun that did it. When he says good night to the mountains, he throws his most beautiful colors over them, so that they may not forget him before he comes again the next day. Heidi was delighted with this explanation, and could hardly bear to wait for another day to come, that she might once more climb up with the goats, and see how the sun bid good night to the mountains. But she had to go to bed first, and all night she slept soundly on her bed of hay, dreaming of nothing but of shining mountains with red roses all over them, among which happy little Schneehöppli went leaping in and out. End of Chapter 3. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 5th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi, Chapter 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org. Heidi by Johanna Spyri, Chapter 4. The Visit to Grandmother. The next morning the sun came out early, as bright as ever, and then Peter appeared with the goats, and again the 2 children climbed up together to the high meadows, and so it went on day after day, till Heidi, passing her life thus among the grass and flowers, was burnt brown with the sun, and grew so strong and healthy that nothing ever ailed her. She was happy, too, and lived from day to day as free and light-hearted as the little birds that make their home among the green forest trees. Then the autumn came, and the wind blew louder and stronger, and the grandfather would say sometimes, "Today you must stay at home, Heidi. A sudden gust of the wind would blow a little thing like you over the rocks into the valley below in a moment." Whenever Peter heard that he must go alone, he looked very unhappy, for he saw nothing but mishaps of all kinds ahead, and did not know how he should bear the long, dull day without Heidi. Then, too, there was the good meal he would miss, and besides that the goats on these days were so naughty and obstinate that he had twice the usual trouble with them, for they had grown so accustomed to Heidi's presence that they would run in every direction, and refuse to go on unless she was with them. Heidi was never unhappy, for wherever she was, she found something to interest or amuse her. She liked best, it is true, to go out with Peter up to the flowers and the great bird, where there was so much to be seen, and so many experiences to go through among the goats with their different characters. But she also found her grandfather's hammering and sawing and carpentering very entertaining, and if it should chance to be the day when the large round goat's milk cheese was made, she enjoyed beyond measure looking on at this wonderful performance, and watching her grandfather, as with sleeves rolled back he stirred the great cauldron with his bare arms. The thing which attracted her most, however, was the waving and roaring of the 3 old fir trees on these windy days. She would run away repeatedly from whatever she might be doing, to listen to them, for nothing seemed so strange and wonderful to her as the deep, mysterious sound in the tops of the trees. She would stand underneath them and look up, unable to tear herself away, looking and listening while they bowed and swayed and roared as the mighty wind rushed through them. There was no longer now the warm, bright sun that had shone all through the summer, so Heidi went to the cupboard and got out her shoes and stockings and dress, for it was growing colder every day, and when Heidi stood under the fir trees the wind blew through her as if she was a thin little leaf, but still she felt she could not stay indoors when she heard the branches waving outside. Then it grew very cold, and Peter would come up early in the morning, blowing on his fingers to keep them warm. But he soon left off coming, for one night there was a heavy fall of snow, and the next morning the whole mountain was covered with it, and not a single little green leaf was to be seen anywhere upon it. There was no Peter that day, and Heidi stood at the little window looking out in wonderment, for the snow was beginning again, and the thick flakes kept falling till the snow was up to the window, and still they continued to fall, and the snow grew higher, so that at last the window could not be opened, and she and her grandfather were shut up fast within the hut. Heidi thought this was great fun, and ran from one window to the other to see what would happen next, and whether the snow was going to cover up the whole hut, so that they would have to light a lamp although it was broad daylight. But things did not get as bad as that, and the next day, the snow having ceased, the grandfather went out and shoveled away the snow round the house, and threw it into such great heaps that they looked like mountains standing at intervals on either side of the hut. And now the windows and door could be opened, and it was well it was so, for as Heidi and her grandfather were sitting one afternoon on their 3-legged stools before the fire, there came a great thump at the door, followed by several others, and then the door opened. It was Peter, who had made all that noise knocking the snow off his shoes. He was still white all over with it, for he had had to fight his way through deep snowdrifts, and large lumps of snow that had frozen upon him still clung to his clothes. He had been determined, however, not to be beaten, and to climb up to the hut, for it was a week now since he had seen Heidi. "Good evening," he said as he came in. Then he went and placed himself as near the fire as he could, without saying another word, but his whole face was beaming with pleasure at finding himself there. Heidi looked on in astonishment, for Peter was beginning to thaw all over with the warmth, so that he had the appearance of a trickling waterfall. "Well, General, and how goes it with you?" said the grandfather. "Now that you have lost your army, you will have to turn to your pen and pencil." "Why must he turn to his pen and pencil?" asked Heidi immediately, full of curiosity. "During the winter he must go to school," explained her grandfather, "and learn how to read and write. It's a bit hard, although useful sometimes afterwards. Am I not right, General?" "Yes, indeed," assented Peter. Heidi's interest was now thoroughly awakened, and she had so many questions to put to Peter about all that was to be done and seen and heard at school, and the conversation took so long that Peter had time to get thoroughly dry. Peter had always great difficulty in putting his thoughts into words, and he found his share of the talk doubly difficult today, for by the time he had an answer ready to one of Heidi's questions, she had already put 2 or 3 more to him, and generally such as required a whole long sentence in reply. The grandfather sat without speaking during this conversation, only now and then a twitch of amusement at the corners of his mouth showed that he was listening. "Well now, General, you have been under fire for some time, and must want some refreshment. Come and join us," he said at last, and as he spoke he rose and went to fetch the supper out of the cupboard, and Heidi pushed the stools to the table. There was also now a bench fastened against the wall, for as he was no longer alone, the grandfather had put up seats of various kinds here and there, long enough to hold 2 persons, for Heidi had a way of always keeping close to her grandfather, whether he was walking, sitting, or standing. So there was a comfortable place for them all 3, and Peter opened his round eyes very wide when he saw what a large piece of meat Alm Uncle gave him on his thick slice of bread. It was a long time since Peter had had anything so nice to eat. As soon as the pleasant meal was over, Peter began to get ready for returning home, for it was already growing dark. He had said his good night and his thanks, and was just going out when he turned again and said, "I shall come again next Sunday, this day week, and grandmother sent word that she would like you to come and see her one day." It was quite a new idea to Heidi that she should go and pay anybody a visit, and she could not get it out of her head, so the first thing she said to her grandfather the next day was, "I must go down and see the grandmother today. She will be expecting me." "The snow is too deep," answered the grandfather, trying to put her off, but Heidi had made up her mind to go, since the grandmother had sent her that message. She stuck to her intention, and not a day passed but what in the course of it she said 5 or 6 times to her grandfather, "I must certainly go today. The grandmother will be waiting for me." On the 4th day, when with every step one took the ground crackled with frost, and the whole vast field of snow was hard as ice, Heidi was sitting on her high stool at dinner with the bright sun shining in upon her through the window, and again repeated her little speech. "I must certainly go down to see the grandmother today, or else I shall keep her waiting too long." The grandfather rose from table, climbed up to the hayloft, and brought down the thick sack that was Heidi's coverlet, and said, "Come along, then." The child skipped out gleefully after him into the glittering world of snow. The old fir trees were standing now quite silent, their branches covered with the white snow, and they looked so lovely as they glittered and sparkled in the sunlight, that Heidi jumped for joy at the sight and kept on calling out, come here, grandfather! The fir trees are all silver and gold." The grandfather had gone into the shed, and he now came out dragging a large hand sleigh along with him. Inside it was a low seat, and the sleigh could be pushed forward and guided by the feet of the one who sat upon it, with the help of a pole that was fastened to the side. After he had been taken round the fir trees by Heidi, that he might see their beauty from all sides, he got into the sleigh and lifted the child onto his lap. Then he wrapped her up in the sack, that she might keep nice and warm, and put his left arm closely round her, for it was necessary to hold her tight during the coming journey. He now grasped the pole with his right hand, and gave the sleigh a push forward with his 2 feet. The sleigh shot down the mountain-side with such rapidity that Heidi thought they were flying through the air like a bird, and shouted aloud with delight. Suddenly they came to a standstill, and there they were at Peter's hut. Her grandfather lifted her out and unwrapped her. "There you are. Now go in, and when it begins to grow dark you must start on your way home again." Then he left her and went up the mountain, pulling his sleigh after him. Heidi opened the door of the hut and stepped into a tiny room that looked very dark, with a fireplace and a few dishes on a wooden shelf. This was the little kitchen. She opened another door and now found herself in another small room, for the place was not a herdsman's hut like her grandfather's, with one large room on the ground floor and a hayloft above, but a very old cottage, where everything was narrow and poor and shabby. A table was close to the door, and as Heidi stepped in she saw a woman sitting at it, putting a patch on a waistcoat which Heidi recognized at once as Peter's. In the corner sat an old woman, bent with age, spinning. Heidi was quite sure this was the grandmother, so she went up to the spinning-wheel and said, "Good day, grandmother. I have come at last. Did you think I was a long time coming?" The woman raised her head and felt for the hand that the child held out to her, and when she found it she passed her own over it thoughtfully for a few seconds, and then said, "Are you the child who lives up with Alm Uncle? Are you Heidi?" "Yes, yes," answered Heidi. "I have just come down in the sleigh with grandfather." "Is it possible? Why, your hands are quite warm. Brigitta, did Alm Uncle come himself with the child?" Peter's mother had left her work and risen from the table, and now stood looking at Heidi with curiosity, scanning her from head to foot. "I do not know, mother, whether Uncle came himself. It is hardly likely. The child probably makes a mistake." But Heidi looked steadily at the woman, not at all as if in any uncertainty, and said, "I know quite well who wrapped me in my bed-cover and brought me down in the sleigh. It was grandfather." There was some truth then, perhaps, in what Peter used to tell us of Alm Uncle during the summer, when we thought he must be wrong, said grandmother. But who would ever have believed that such a thing was possible? I did not think the child would live 3 weeks up there. What is she like, Brigitta? The latter had so thoroughly examined Heidi on all sides that she was well able to describe her to her mother. "She has Adelheid's slenderness of figure, but her eyes are dark, and her hair curly like her father's, and the old man's up there. She takes after both of them, I think." Heidi, meanwhile, had not been idle. She had made the round of the room and looked carefully at everything there was to be seen. All of a sudden she exclaimed, "Grandmother, one of your shutters is flapping backwards and forwards. Grandfather would put a nail in and make it all right in a minute, or else it will break one of the panes some day. Look, look, how it keeps on banging." "Ah, dear child," said the old woman, "I am not able to see it, but I can hear that and many other things besides the shutter. Everything about the place rattles and creaks when the wind is blowing, and it gets inside through all the cracks and holes. The house is going to pieces, and in the night, when the 2 others are asleep, I often lie awake in fear and trembling, thinking that the whole place will give way and fall and kill us. And there is not a creature to mend anything for us, for Peter does not understand such work." "But why cannot you see, grandmother, that the shutter is loose? Look, there it goes again. See, that one there." And Heidi pointed to the particular shutter. "Alas, child, it is not the only thing I cannot see. I can see nothing, nothing," said the grandmother in a voice of lamentation. "But if I were to go outside and put back the shutter so that you had more light, then could you see, grandmother?" "No, no, not even then. No one can make it light for me again." "But if you were to go outside among all the white snow, then surely you would find it light. Just come with me, grandmother, and I will show you." Heidi took hold of the old woman's hand to lead her along, for she was beginning to feel quite distressed at the thought of her being without light. "Let me be, dear child. It is always dark for me now, whether in snow or sun. No light can penetrate my eyes." "But surely it does in summer, grandmother," said Heidi, more and more anxious to find some way out of the trouble. "When the hot sun is shining down again, and he says good night to the mountains, and they all turn on fire, and the yellow flowers shine like gold, then, you will see, it will be bright and beautiful for you again." "Ah, child, I shall see the mountains on fire or the yellow flowers no more. It will never be light for me again on earth, never." At these words Heidi broke into loud crying. In her distress she kept on sobbing out, "Who can make it light for you again? Can no one do it? Isn't there anyone who can do it?" The grandmother now tried to comfort the child, but it was not easy to quiet her. Heidi did not often weep, but when she did she could not get over her trouble for a long while. The grandmother had tried all means in her power to allay the child's grief, for it went to her heart to hear her sobbing so bitterly. At last she said, "Come here, dear Heidi. Come and let me tell you something. You cannot think how glad one is to hear a kind word when one can no longer see, and it is such a pleasure to me to listen to you while you talk. So come and sit beside me, and tell me something. Tell me what you do up there, and how grandfather occupies himself. I knew him very well in old days, but for many years now I have heard nothing of him, except through Peter, who never says much." This was a new and happy idea to Heidi. She quickly dried her tears, and said in a comforting voice, "Wait, grandmother, till I have told grandfather everything. He will make it light for you again, I am sure, and will do something so that the house will not fall. He will put everything right for you." The grandmother was silent, and Heidi now began to give her a lively description of her life with the grandfather, and of the days she spent on the mountain with the goats, and then went on to tell her of what she did now during the winter, and how her grandfather was able to make all sorts of things, seats and stools, and mangers where the hay was put for Schwenli and Berli, besides a new large water-tub for her to bathe in when the summer came, and a new milk-bowl and spoon, and Heidi grew more and more animated as she enumerated all the beautiful things which were made so magically out of pieces of wood. She then told the grandmother how she stood by him and watched all he did, and how she hoped some day to be able to make the same herself. The grandmother listened with the greatest attention, only from time to time addressing her daughter, "Do you hear that, Brigitta? Do you hear what she is saying about uncle?" The conversation was all at once interrupted by a heavy thump on the door, and in marched Peter, who stood stock-still, opening his eyes with astonishment when he caught sight of Heidi. Then his face beamed with smiles as she called out, "Good evening, Peter." "What? Is the boy back from school already?" exclaimed the grandmother in surprise. "I have not known an afternoon pass so quickly as this one for years. How is the reading getting on, Peter?" "Just the same," was Peter's answer. The old woman gave a little sigh. "Ah, well," she said, "I hoped you would have something different to tell me by this time, as you are going to be 12 years old this February." "What was it that you hoped he would have to tell you?" asked Heidi, interested in all the grandmother said. "I mean that he ought to have learnt to read a bit by now," continued the grandmother. "Up there on the shelf is an old prayer book, with beautiful songs in it which I have not heard for a long time and cannot now remember to repeat to myself, and I hoped that Peter would soon learn enough to be able to read one of them to me sometimes, but he finds it too difficult." "I must get a light. It is getting too dark to see," said Peter's mother, who was still busy mending his waistcoat. "I feel too as if the afternoon had gone I hardly know how." Heidi now jumped up from her low chair, and, holding out her hand hastily to the grandmother, said, "Good night, grandmother. If it is getting dark, I must go home at once." And, bidding good-bye to Peter and his mother, she went towards the door. But the grandmother called out in an anxious voice, "Wait, wait, Heidi. You must not go alone like that. Peter must go with you, and take care of the child, Peter, that she does not fall. And don't let her stand still for fear she should get frozen, do you hear? Has she got anything warm to put around her throat?" "I have not anything to put on," called back Heidi, "but I am sure I shall not be cold." And with that she ran outside, and went off at such a pace that Peter had difficulty in overtaking her. The grandmother, still in distress, called out to her daughter, "Run after her, Brigitta. The child will be frozen to death on such a night as this. Take my shawl. Run quickly." Brigitta ran out, but the children had taken but a few steps before they saw the grandfather coming down to meet them, and in another minute his long strides had brought him to their side. "That's right, Heidi, you have kept your word," said the grandfather, and then wrapping the sack firmly round her, he lifted her in his arms, and strode off with her up the mountain. Brigitte was just in time to see him do all this, and on her return to the hut with Peter expressed her astonishment to the grandmother. The latter was equally surprised, and kept on saying, "God be thanked that he is good to the child. God be thanked. Will he let her come to me again, I wonder? The child has done me so much good. What a loving little heart it is, and how merrily she tells her tale." And she continued to dwell with delight on the thought of the child until she went to bed, still saying now and again, "If only she will come again, now I have really something left in the world to take pleasure in." And Brigitte agreed with all her mother said, and Peter nodded his head in approval each time his grandmother spoke, saying, with a broad smile of satisfaction, "I told you so." Meanwhile Heidi was chattering away to her grandfather from inside her sack. Her voice, however, could not reach him through the many thick folds of her wrap, and as therefore it was impossible to understand a word she was saying, he called to her, "Wait till we get home, and then you can tell me all about it." They had no sooner got inside the hut than Heidi, having been released from her covering, at once began what she had to say. "Grandfather, tomorrow we must take the hammer and the long nails and fasten grandmother's shutter, and drive in a lot more nails in other places, for her house shakes and rattles all over." "We must we? Who told you that?" asked her grandfather. "Nobody told me, but I know it for all that," replied Heidi. "For everything is giving way, and when the grandmother cannot sleep, she lies trembling for fear at the noise, for she thinks that every minute the house will fall down on their heads, and everything now is dark for grandmother, and she does not think anyone can make it light for her again. But you will be able to, I am sure, grandfather. Think how dreadful it is for her to be always in the dark, and then to be frightened at what may happen. And nobody can help her but you. Tomorrow we must go and help her. We will, won't we, grandfather?" The child was clinging to the old man and looking up at him in trustful confidence. The grandfather looked down at Heidi for a while without speaking, and then said, "Yes, Heidi, we will do something to stop the rattling. At least we can do that. We will go down about it tomorrow." The child went skipping round the room for joy, crying out, "We shall go tomorrow! We shall go tomorrow!" The grandfather kept his promise. On the following afternoon he brought the sleigh out again, and as on the previous day, he set Heidi down at the door of the grandmother's hut, and said, "Go in now, and when it grows dark, come out again." Then he put the sack in the sleigh, and went round the house. Heidi had hardly opened the door and sprung into the room when the grandmother called out from her corner, "It's the child again! Here she comes!" And in her delight she let the thread drop from her fingers, and the wheel stood still as she stretched out both her hands in welcome. Heidi ran to her, and then quickly drew the little stool close up to the old woman, and, seating herself upon it, began to tell and ask her all kinds of things. All at once came the sound of heavy blows against the walls of the hut, and the grandmother gave such a start of alarm that she nearly upset the spinning-wheel, and cried in a trembling voice, "Ah, my God, now it is coming! The house is going to fall upon us!" But Heidi caught her by the arm and said soothingly, "No, no, grandmother, do not be frightened. It is only grandfather with his hammer. He is mending up everything, so that you shan't have such fear and trouble." "Is it possible? Is it really possible? So the dear God has not forgotten us!" exclaimed the grandmother. "Do you hear, Brigitte, what that noise is? Do you hear what the child says? Now, as I listen, I can tell it is a hammer. Go outside, Brigitte, and if it is Alm uncle, Tell him he must come inside a moment, that I may thank him." Brigitte went outside and found Alm Uncle in the act of fastening some heavy pieces of new wood along the wall. She stepped up to him and said, "Good evening, uncle. Mother and I have to thank you for doing us such a kind service, and she would like to tell you herself how grateful she is. I do not know who else would have done it for us. We shall not forget your kindness, for I am sure—" "That will do," said the old man, interrupting her. "I know what you think of Alm Uncle without your telling me. Go indoors again. I can find out for myself where the mending is wanted." Brigitte obeyed on the spot, for Uncle had a way with him that made few people care to oppose his will. He went on knocking with his hammer all round the house, and then mounted the narrow steps to the roof and hammered away there until he had used up all the nails he had brought with him. Meanwhile it had been growing dark, and he had hardly come down from the roof and dragged the sleigh out from behind the goat-shed, when Heidi appeared outside. The grandfather wrapped her up and took her in his arms as he had done the day before, for although he had to drag the sleigh up the mountain after him, he feared that if the child sat in it alone her wrappings would fall off, and that she would be nearly if not quite frozen. So he carried her warm and safe in his arms. So the winter went by. After many years of joyless life, the blind grandmother had at last found something to make her happy. Her days were no longer passed in weariness and darkness, one like the other, without pleasure or change. For now she had always something to which she could look forward. She listened for the little tripping footstep as soon as day had come, and when she heard the door open and knew the child was really there, she would call out, "God be thanked, she has come again." And Heidi would sit by her and talk, and tell her everything she knew in so lively a manner that the grandmother never noticed how the time went by, and never now as formerly asked Brigitte, "Isn't the day done yet?" But as the child shut the door behind her on leaving, would exclaim, "How short the afternoon has seemed! Don't you think so, Brigitte?" And this one would answer, "I do indeed. It seems as if I had only just cleared away the midday meal." And the grandmother would continue, "Pray God the child is not taken from me, and that Alm Uncle continues to let her come. Does she look well and strong, Brigitte?" And the latter would answer, "She looks as bright and rosy as an apple." And Heidi had also grown very fond of the old grandmother, and when at last she knew for certain that no one could make it light for her again, she was overcome with sorrow. But the grandmother told her again that she felt the darkness much less when Heidi was with her. And so every fine winter's day the child came traveling down in her sleigh. The grandfather always took her, never raising any objection. Indeed, he always carried the hammer and sundry other things down in the sleigh with him. And many an afternoon was spent by him in making the goatherd's cottage sound and tight. It no longer groaned and rattled the whole night through, and the grandmother, who for many winters had not been able to sleep in peace as she did now, said she should never forget what the uncle had done for her. End of Chapter 4. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 13th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi, Chapter 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 5. 2 Visits, and What Came of Them. Quickly the winter passed, and still more quickly the bright, glad summer, and now another winter was drawing to its close. Heidi was still as light-hearted and happy as the birds, and looked forward with more delight each day to the coming spring, when the warm south wind would roar through the fir trees and blow away the snow, and the warm sun would entice the blue and yellow flowers to show their heads, and the long days out on the mountain would come again, which seemed to Heidi the greatest joy that earth could give. Heidi was now in her 8th year. She had learnt all kinds of useful things from her grandfather. She knew how to look after the goats as well as anyone, and Schwenli and Berli would follow her like 2 faithful dogs, and give a loud bleat of pleasure when they heard her voice. Twice during the course of this last winter Peter had brought up a message from the schoolmaster at Dorfli, who sent word to Alm Uncle that he ought to send Heidi to school, as she was over the usual age, and ought indeed to have gone the winter before. Uncle had sent word back each time that the schoolmaster would find him at home if he had anything he wished to say to him, but that he did not intend to send Heidi to school, and Peter had faithfully delivered his message. When the March sun had melted the snow on the mountain-side, and the snowdrops were peeping out all over the valley, and the fir trees had shaken off their burden of snow, and were again merrily waving their branches in the air, Heidi ran backwards and forwards with delight, first to the goat-shed, then to the fir trees, and then to the hut door, in order to let her grandfather know how much larger a piece of green there was under the trees, and then would run off to look again, for she could hardly wait till everything was green, and the full beautiful summer had clothed the mountain with grass and flowers. As Heidi was thus running about one sunny March morning, and had just jumped over the water trough for the 10th time at least, she nearly fell backwards into it with fright, for there in front of her, looking gravely at her, stood an old gentleman dressed in black.